All right, so for this particular conversation, we are going to be starting our digestive system. And so moving into the next two chapters that we're really going to talk about as a set. So we moved through cardio and respiratory, they work hand in hand. Now we're getting into digestive and the excretory system because they need each other in order to be able to fully do their own job. And so digestion is something that a lot of people feel pretty comfortable with it. I'm also going to introduce a couple of ideas that maybe you haven't thought about or realized that are actually taking place during the process of digestion. And then we're also going to do a section on nutrition. So it's not just about eating foods, but ultimately, once those foods are present in our body, what are we going to do with them and how are we going to use them? So when we look at that first slide, it talks about the different functions that you have with the process of digestion. Obviously, the first thing is we have to get the food into our body. So ingestion is going to be consuming the food, swallowing it, and getting it into the beginning of the digestive tract. Then you have the process of, and I'm going to skip those two types of digestion for just a second. You get into propulsion. And even from the time that food leaves your mouth, it is going to need a mechanical way to move that food through your body. So when you swallow, it's not gravity that's taking food down to your stomach. It is actually going to be a systematic set of wave like actions with the muscles in your esophagus as well as your intestinal tract to make sure that that food continues to move forward. So propulsion is just talking about those muscle contractions that have to happen in order to make sure that food is getting from point A to point B. Absorption, that is the actual process of food being pulled into your body. So it's the transition from it being in your digestive tract to actually being in your bloodstream to where you can use it. And the food is not considered to be internal until it actually makes that switch. So in the respiratory chapter, we talked about internal and external respiration. And as long as that air was in the tubes, so your trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, it was not internal. Until it crosses over into your bloodstream, that's when we would consider it to be internal. And likewise with food, just because you swallow it and it's in your stomach, it's not considered to be internal until it makes its way into the small intestine and it transfers from being in your alimentary canal and actually becomes part of your bloodstream. Once that transition takes place, then it's considered to be internal. And that process of absorption is taking in all those materials from the foods that you put into your body. And then we have defecation. So I've mentioned several times since the start of the year, nothing works at 100% efficiency. There's no machine, there is no living organism that is 100% efficient in anything that it does. And so you're going to have a waste product. And the process of digestion is the exact same way. There is nothing that we will eat that we fully absorb, that we use 100%. And so whatever we don't use or take in, we have to get that out of our system. And so that is the process of defecation, is just removing or eliminating those materials that we can't put to use. So going back to the two types of digestion. So looking at the process of digestion, we are going to use a couple of different methods to break down any food that we put into our body. And so we can do that mechanically, which simply means we're using muscles to break down the food, or we can do that chemically. And that's going to be the use of an enzyme or some type of chemical that the body has in order to break down the bonds within the foods that we eat. The one thing that I want you guys to keep in mind as we move through the digestive chapter is there is nothing that we put into our body that is immediately usable. And what I mean by that is food molecules are way too large for our body to be able to put to use. So when we talk about the process of digestion, what we are actually talking about is taking those food molecules and they're linked together by bonds. We're going to take them and we are going to break those bonds and break down the food molecule and get a large piece of food or a large molecule and break it down into smaller pieces that we will actually then be able to put to use. So, kind of keep that in mind. We're really targeting those bonds within the foods we're eating, breaking those apart so that we can get the food into small enough pieces that we can get to that point of absorption. We have to be able to get it to cross over from being in the intestinal tract and being able to make the move over into our bloodstream. And obviously, it is going to have to be in a fairly small form to be able to do that. If you look at your second slide, it talks about the major organs of the system. And I'm going to hit on these, but we'll come back to them as we move through the packet as well. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on them right now because we'll pick them up through the packet slides as well. So this particular slide, the reason that I included it is because it divides into a left and a right. And if you look at the left, these are the accessory organs, and there are 4 of them. So you have the salivary glands, which are going to be in your mouth. You have the liver, you have the gallbladder, and then you also have the pancreas. So the reason that those would fall into the accessory organs is because these are going to add a very important step to the process of digestion, but they do not come in contact with the food directly. So that is what puts them in that accessory organ or accessory gland category, is they add something very important to the process, but they're never going to directly touch the food. On the right hand side, you have a list of those structures that the food is actually going to come into contact with. It will pass directly through it. So with the alimentary canal, you have the mouth. So obviously that's how we initially are going to introduce the food to our mouth. Then we have the pharynx, which is the space at the back of our mouth where the nose and the throat come together. Moving into the esophagus, which is the tube that will transport the food from our mouth down to the stomach. It gets into the stomach itself, and then we're going to move into the intestinal tract. We go from the small intestine to the large intestine, and then eventually it will pass out of the body through the rectum. So keep in mind that with the alimentary canal, until we get to that small intestine, the food is simply passing through a hollow space in the body. It is not usable until we get it into the small intestine and that absorption takes place. At that point, we're able to get the calories, we're able to get the nutrients, we're able to absorb the fat into our bloodstream and really get a lot of benefit from the foods that we are eating. There's a small exception to that, which we'll get to in just a minute. So the next slide that you have talks about the alimentary canal. And this one is, I think, interesting because when you think about the average person, the average woman is going to be somewhere around 5.5 feet tall. The average male is going to be somewhere around 6 feet tall. And when you start looking at the breakdown of our alimentary canal from the mouth until it exits our body, you have a very good amount of intestinal tract and other structures that the food is going to have to pass through. So the tongue, the esophagus, gallbladder, everything until you get up to the intestinal tract, not a huge amount of length. But then once we get into the small intestine and the large intestine, now you're really going to see a good amount of material. So your small intestine is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 26 feet long. And I know that's kind of a wide range, but again, when you're talking about males to females and height differences, you account for that 6 feet of difference. But for the average person, you're looking at 20 to 26 feet worth of small intestine alone. The large intestine is going to add on another 3 to 4 feet. So when you put food into your body, it has a pretty good distance that it has to travel. And earlier I was talking about propulsion. So when you start thinking about 30 some feet worth of intestinal tract that food is going to have to pass through, you can start to see why that's not just going to happen naturally on its own. And you will need that muscle movement in order to help the food continue on its path and make its way through all of those intestines. So starting with the structures that food is going to pass through, we have the mouth at the beginning. So obviously, like I said, this is how you're introducing food to the body. And there are so many structures within the mouth that we really don't even think twice about just because it's second nature. We're just very used to the shape and the design of our mouth, and we really don't think twice about the importance of the layout. So when you think about just the teeth alone, in your children, you're going to have 20 teeth. So as a child, that is the normal number of teeth that you should have. And you want your children's teeth to actually have gaps between them, because when you transition from baby teeth into your adult teeth, obviously adult teeth are going to be larger, and so they need to have some space. So you want there to be gaps and spacing between the teeth when they're little, and then when the teeth transition, it will fill up that extra space. By the time you're an adult, you will graduate up to 32 teeth, and the position of the teeth is very, very important. Your sharp, narrow teeth are at the front of your mouth, and the broad, flat teeth are going to be more to the back of your mouth. And the reason for this is how we rip and tear into foods that we're eating. So if you bite into a sandwich or if you bite into an apple, you need those sharp, narrow teeth to help make that an easy process. Once we get it into our mouth, now we're going to use our tongue to push it back between those broad, flat teeth. And now we are going to grind that food down between the teeth. This is where that mechanical digestion is going to come into play. So mechanical digestion, mechanical indicates muscles. We're using muscles to help break down the food. So as that food is getting pushed around and mashed between your teeth, those muscles of your jaw opening and closing to carry out the act of chewing, that is mechanical digestion. You are using muscles to break down the food. Now, the reason that chewing is so important is because when you chew your food and you mash it between your teeth, you are exposing more and more surface area of the food every time that you crush it between your teeth, especially those big, broad, flat ones in the back. So the exposure, the amount of food that you can expose by chewing it is going to help the process of digestion as it moves forward into the stomach and the small intestine. And we'll talk about that, like I said, as we continue on with the slides. But just understanding how important that process of chewing is. Chewing is going to break the food apart. It's going to increase the amount of surface area that is exposed to the chemicals and other things that the food is going to come in contact with as it goes through digestion. Now, it's not uncommon that your body would use both mechanical and chemical types of digestion, and the mouth is going to be the first example of that. So we already talked about the muscles carrying out the chewing action, but the other thing that you have is you have your saliva. And while most of your saliva is going to be water, on the same token, it has a digestive enzyme known as amylase. And amylase is AMYLASE. Amylase is a digestive enzyme that is going to target carbohydrates. So anything that is sugar or starch base is going to be broken down by that amylase. It's a digestive enzyme, like I said, that is carried in your saliva. So it's not just enough to chew up your food, but you want to use your tongue to move it around in your mouth and really coat as much of that saliva into the food as you possibly can. It not only makes the process of swallowing easier, but the other thing that it's going to do is anything that is sugary or starch based is going to start to be digested while it's right there in your mouth. You guys have experienced this 100 times, a lot more than that. But if you put a piece of gum into your mouth and it starts out as a big wad of gum, you'll notice after you chew it for a while, it's much smaller in size. Put a piece of hard candy in your mouth and you let it sit there long enough and it eventually dissolves and disappears, because while it's sitting in your mouth, the amylase is eating away at the sugar that was present in the gum or the sugar that was present in that hard candy, and it's digesting it and breaking it down. So that initial part of digestion is going to begin, like I said, right there in your mouth. Now, anything that is protein based or fat based, you can chew it, you can get it into smaller pieces, but you're not actually digesting it in the way of breaking the bonds that is holding those materials together. So amylase is going to break the bonds in the sugar, it's going to break the bonds in the starch based material. Um, for anything else, like I said, you can chew it and get it into physically smaller pieces, but you're not doing anything that is going to break the bonds of the food that you're eating. If you look at the next slide, it talks about the secondary teeth. I already introduced this. Um, One thing that I didn't mention, if you look at the design of the mouth as far as the arch, you have an arch shape to both the upper and lower jaw. You guys also know that you have an arch at the roof of your mouth. This is all designed so that as that food is moving around in your mouth, not only are you working that saliva into it, but you're also going to get it into a circular formation, which is going to help the swallowing process. If you look at the salivary glands, we have a total of 6 salivary glands in the human body. We have 3 that are located on each side of the face. And this particular picture is going to just show you the location of those. So you can see the 3 gland structures themselves. You have the parotid, which is kind of on point with the ear. And then you also have the sublingual, which is going to be positioned under the tongue. And then you have the submandibular, which goes with the mandible, which is the movable bone in your jaw. So they're named for the structures of the bones that they are located very closely to. Now, with the parotid, if you look at that picture, you can actually see the duct that comes out of the parotid salivary gland and injects into the top part of your cheek. And so you have saliva that is going to enter your mouth through that. This is actually a very common place to get cavities because of where it's positioned in the mouth. People don't brush it very well, but because you have that saliva coming in and that amylase that is going to help digest sugars, if you don't brush it well, it's just a high target area for cavities to develop and form. Sublingual gets its name because it's positioned under the tongue, and submandibular, like I said, with the bone structure that it's positioned by. But you have 3 on each side. Um, if you have ever eaten something that has a very strong taste, usually very strong sour or very sugary, some people will actually complain of like an ache or a pain in their cheeks. And when you eat something, like I said, that has a very strong taste to it, what's happening is those saliva glands are contracting with a lot of force to get as much saliva into the mouth as quickly as they possibly can. And some people will kind of feel that as a tingling sensation. Some people describe it as almost painful. But that's actually what you're feeling is that sensation of your salivary glands trying to push as much saliva into your mouth as possible to target those sugars, those starches, and really start the process of digesting them. So once we've worked that amylase into our food, we've started the process of breaking down the sugar and starch-based things. Now we're going to transition the food to our stomach, and that is going to happen by way of the esophagus. The esophagus is a tube-like structure. It's actually positioned behind the trachea. So if you were to go from the front towards the back, you would run into the trachea first, and then tucked behind the trachea is the esophagus. Now remember, the trachea has cartilage to help hold it open. The esophagus does not. So when the esophagus is not being used, it actually closes down almost flat. And I put that picture in on the right-hand side so that you can see what that esophagus looks like when it's not being used. We talk about it being a tube, so people have this picture that it's just always this nice round open structure, and that's not the case. Because it doesn't have any cartilage or any support to hold it open, if you're not actively swallowing, it is going to kind of collapse on itself. But the esophagus is going to help transition that food down to the stomach. As I already mentioned, it does need the use of muscles to help move that food down. So the inside of the esophagus is lined with nerves, and those nerves detect when you've swallowed the food, and they will cause the muscles right above the ball of food to contract. And those muscles contract, they push the food down. That hits the next set of nerves in the esophagus and causes another set of muscles to contract. And it's just that process then of working that food down. You can see based on that picture on the right hand side why that food is going to need some help getting down from the mouth to the stomach. Once we get the food down to the stomach, there is a special type of muscle at the entrance to the stomach and at the exit of the stomach. And so, where the esophagus connects into the stomach, and then ultimately where the small intestine connects to the stomach, you have what are known as sphincter muscles. Sphincter muscles make a full circle around a structure, and when they contract, they help to close off 2 different areas of the body. So in this particular case, once we get that food from the esophagus down into the stomach, we don't want it to return back up. And so that sphincter muscle is going to contract. It's going to then close off the esophagus from the stomach. This is important for a few reasons. Number one, we want to make sure that the food is getting digested well, so we need to keep it in the stomach, but also the contents of the stomach are very acidic, and we don't want that washing back up into the esophagus. Now, there are situations where that sphincter muscle does not close off properly, and acid from the stomach is allowed to push back up into the esophagus. And because of that, it will start to burn the inside of the esophagus wall. And that is what people, when they complain of heartburn, that's essentially what they're talking about. They can actually feel that acid pushing back up into their esophagus and burning that lining. If you look at the next slide that talks about the stomach, when you look at the stomach, most people are somewhat familiar with the shape, but again, the theme of the whole year has kind of been that nothing happens by chance when we talk about anatomy. Everything has a specific reason. So when you look at the stomach and the shape of the stomach, there's a very specific reason that it is shaped the way that it is. So it almost has a J shape design to it. You'll notice that the area where the esophagus comes in is positioned higher than the position of where the small intestine will exit out. But then there's also a portion of the stomach that sits lower than that exit to the small intestine. And the reason for that is when you take food into your stomach, it's going to sit there for anywhere from 3 to 4 hours. So if you had one of those moms that told you you couldn't go swimming for 30 minutes after you ate, it was more like 3 to 4 hours, because that is how long that food is going to hang out in your stomach and go through the process of digestion. So we want to have that space that is positioned below both the entrance and the exit to the stomach, just so it is in a good spot to really get through the process of digestion. Now, while that food is in your stomach, we have both mechanical and chemical digestion also happening in the stomach. You'll notice from the picture on the right, that is a cross section of the stomach. So they've cut it in half. You're actually looking at the inside of the stomach, and it's not flat, it's not smooth. You have these hills, peaks, and valleys within the stomach, and those are called rugae. So, what they do is they increase the surface area inside your stomach, but they also create spaces where food is going to get in between those wrinkles and those folds. And now, when your stomach contracts, it's going to mash over that food, and it just creates more area where that food is going to get broken down into smaller and smaller parts. Now, the other thing besides your muscles, the mechanical digestion of your stomach contracting over itself, you are going to have a couple different types of chemical digestion going on here. So you have a digestive enzyme known as pepsin, and this is actually on your next slide as well. So please look at the productions of the stomach as well as the picture of the stomach as we're going through this next part of the conversation. So the pepsin is going to be a digestive enzyme that is going to now target protein. So the mouth, we target sugar-based foods. When the food makes its way down to the stomach, now we're targeting those things that are made of protein. So meat would be a good example. Eggs have protein, peanut butter, things like that. This is really where they are going to get digested. And what I just want to remind you, when we talk about digestion, we're talking about breaking bonds. Okay? So not just chewing it up and making it smaller pieces of food, but actually breaking the bonds that are holding the food together. So the pepsin is going to target those protein-based foods. And then you're also going to have hydrochloric acid that is going to be produced from these tiny little jets inside your stomach. And the hydrochloric acid is going to rank very low on the pH scale, somewhere around 2 or 3 on the pH scale. So it's very intense, and that is all geared at just doing as much as we possibly can to break down that food and get it into small pieces and really break down the bonds within the foods that we've eaten. So 3 to 4 hours, it's going to go through this process of getting mashed down, as well as coated with this digestive enzyme, as well as the hydrochloric acid. The pictures on the left of the stomach show you the direction that the muscles run that make up the outside of the stomach. And you'll notice that they don't run in all the same directions. Some of them are going horizontally, some of them are diagonal, some of them run perpendicular. And that's all to make sure that that food is going to get contracted and mashed over and really worked through the process of digestion. Now, if you're looking at the productions of the stomach, one thing that I do want to point out is I talked about pepsin being a digestive enzyme that targets protein, but it's not able to distinguish between protein that makes up your body parts and protein from the foods that you've eaten. There are pretty much there is pretty much protein in every structure of our body: your muscles, your skin, your hair, your nails, um, your cells, your DNA. All of that has protein. Your organelles within your cells, they all have protein. So now we have this digestive enzyme that breaks down protein and can't distinguish between what's your body and what is food. So your body created a very specific system to make sure that we're only able to digest the proteins from the foods we put into our system. So what happens is the pepsin is actually going to be kept in an inactive form. And we've talked about the same process before when we talked about fibrin and fibrinogen. Your body will make things in a way that they are inactive until they're in the right time and place that we need them to be used, and then we have a way to activate them. So this digestive enzyme pepsin is the same way. When it's initially produced, it's in the form of pepsinogen. It's inactive, it can't do anything. Then it is eventually going to be delivered to the stomach. And the only thing that will convert that pepsinogen into an active form is hydrochloric acid. The only place in the human body that you find hydrochloric acid is in your stomach. So now, by design, our body has created a way that we can have this digestive enzyme, but we can manipulate exactly when and how it works. So we only can introduce it to hydrochloric acid when it's in the stomach. It will then convert to pepsin, and now we have a place where it will break down protein. Now, some of you might be thinking or worrying about the fact that the stomach is made of protein, and that's very, very true. So the body took it one step further and it lined your stomach with goblet cells that will produce mucus. And your stomach is actually going to be coated with a very thick lining of mucus to create a buffer between the protein that makes up your stomach and the food itself. So you have your stomach, then a very thick lining of mucus, and then you would have the food and the pepsin on the other side of that mucus lining. So it should not ever get to the stomach itself and be able to do any damage. Okay. Now, you'll notice I said should. There are situations where, unfortunately, that mucus lining breaks down and the pepsin is able to reach the stomach itself. And what happens then is that pepsin will digest, break down, eat away the protein lining of the stomach. And that's a situation where you get into an ulcer. So the main things that will cause that to happen, if you have somebody that is very, very stressed and they are overproducing hydrochloric acid, it will get to a point where that mucus just can't create enough of a barrier, and the hydrochloric acid will work through the mucus lining, allowing the pepsin to get to the stomach. Pepsin will then break down the protein and eats away at the stomach lining. If you also are somebody that has a very high salt content, that can also be another big trigger for the formation of ulcers. And some medications will actually help the process of ulcer formation. If you move on to the pancreas is going to come up in a couple different conversations just because it also has some jobs within the endocrine system as well. So we will touch on it here just in what it does for digestion, and then you'll hear it come up again when we get into later chapters. So the pancreas is an oblong-shaped gland, and we refer to it as gland because it does produce secretions. And one of the things that it will do for the process of digestion is it will produce a digestive enzyme that can break down carbohydrates, that can break down protein, and that can break down fat. And the reason that I point that out is because that's very, very unique. Most of those are going to be very targeted. So sugar gets targeted in the mouth, and that's the only thing. Protein gets targeted in the stomach, and fats get targeted in the small intestine. So very deliberate in where those things are broken down and worked on in the digestive process. The pancreas is unique in the fact that it can help with all three. The other big thing that the pancreas is going to do is it produces something called insulin. Now, insulin is a secretion that will actually help get glucose from your bloodstream into your cells. Without glucose, that transition can't happen. So you break down food into its simplest, most basic form, and some of that is going to end up becoming glucose, sugar. That glucose is then absorbed into your bloodstream. It will circulate through your bloodstream and it's delivered to your cells. Because if you think back to our cellular respiration conversation we had way back in first semester, glucose is the driving force behind cellular respiration and producing ATP, which is the fuel for our cells. Glucose unlocks that whole process and allows it to happen. So for those people that don't produce insulin in the right levels or don't produce insulin at all, that transition of getting that glucose from the blood to your cells so that they can go through the process of cellular respiration doesn't happen. And when that doesn't happen, every time you eat or drink and that material is broken down, that glucose is going to make its way into your bloodstream, but we're not using it. It's not getting consumed up by your cells. And so those glucose levels will continue to rise. And that is what you guys know to be diabetes. So anytime the insulin is not functioning properly, it's not working as a way to get the sugar from your blood into your cells, glucose isn't getting used up and just keeps building up in the bloodstream until those levels get very, very high and cause lots of problems within the body. The next one that we have is the liver. The liver is an amazing organ. It's the largest internal organ that we have, and I'm stressing internal. So your skin is your overall largest organ, and then we get to the liver. The liver is kind of a triangular shaped structure, and it tapers as it comes across the front of the body and makes its way over towards the stomach. Um, the liver has over 200 different jobs that it carries out for the human body. So again, this is something that will come up in multiple conversations and multiple body systems just because it has a hand in so many things that take place in our body. Now, one of the structures that you'll notice is attached to the liver is the gallbladder. It's a tiny little green gland that you have, and it's stained green because of the material that it holds. So in your liver, you produce bile. That bile is then going to be transitioned and held in the gallbladder until it needs to be used. And then ultimately, that bile is going to be injected into your small intestine. This is our third digestive enzyme. So bile made in the liver, stored in the gallbladder, used in the small intestine, and it targets our third calorie source of fat. So we get calories from carbs, we get calories from proteins, we get calories from fat. So it's a little bit different in the digestive process because in breaking down fats, we don't really digest them. It's a process called emulsification. Fat is very sticky and it likes to stick to itself and form these globs. So bile is a digestive enzyme that coats the fat from our diet and breaks it apart into smaller globules that are more manageable for our body. So it's not a true digestion. We're not breaking the bonds within the fat. We are simply taking the big globs and we're breaking them down, pulling them apart through the process of emulsification. So your liver Like I said, over 200 different functions. The main one that I want you guys to know for right now with this digestive system is that it's going to produce the bile, stored in that gallbladder, that little green pocket, and then it's going to be injected into the small intestine when food is present and coat over that fat and help break it down into smaller pieces. From there, we move into the small intestine. And the small intestine has three major parts to it. So, coming out of the stomach, you have the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. This is a term that gets different pronunciations. Some people will say duodenum. I've always used and been presented with duodenum. So, coming out of the stomach into that first section of the small intestine, there's another sphincter muscle, and that is going to close off the stomach to the small intestine. The reason that that is so important is I talked earlier about your food staying in your stomach for 3 to 4 hours. After that time, it's not like the stomach just flushes everything and immediately passes it on to the small intestine. We're trying to maximize how much nutrition we get out of the foods that we've eaten. And so that transition from the stomach into the small intestine is going to happen in small waves. So that sphincter muscle will relax a little bit and let a portion, not all, of the contents move from the stomach into the small intestine. And 15-20 minutes later, it will relax again, let a little bit more of the contents move forward, and it will continue with that process until it is completely empty. But that sphincter muscle that connects the stomach to the small intestine allows for that staggered transition of the stomach contents into the small intestine. When that transition happens, you would not recognize your food at that point. After sitting in your stomach for 3 to 4 hours, coated in hydrochloric acid, all these digestive enzymes, it's now a chyme mixture, CHYME. Very thick, very soupy, but we have exposed as much of the food as we possibly can to, again, help with the next step in the process of digestion. So we go from the duodenum to the jejunum, and then we have the ileum within the small intestine. Now, small intestine, 20 to 26 feet long, and it weaves back and forth. Nothing happens in the body for no reason. Okay? I know that's not great English, but the reason that your intestine is going to wave back and forth is if you have ever seen somebody do the bottle flip where they pick up a bottle and they flip it, the water that's in that bottle doesn't stay put. When you flip the bottle, the water inside goes all over, it hits the sides of the water bottle itself. And that same sort of thing is happening within your small intestine. The reason that we want it to wind back and forth and flip back and forth is because along the outer edge of your small intestine, you have these tiny little structures called villi. Best example or visual I can give you is to think of them as being tiny little straws. Now, they only stick a short distance off of the inside of your small intestine, but as that chyme mixture runs over those villi, they basically suck out the nutrition, the calories, the vitamins, all of that material that you want to now transition into your bloodstream are going to come out through those villi. But like I said, they only come a short distance off of that small intestine wall. So if you just had this material passing through the small intestine and it wasn't getting flipped and moved around, you would miss so much of the contents because they would stay right through the middle of the tube and never bump into those villi. So by having it weave back and forth, we flip that chyme mixture, we make sure that it gets to the walls, and we are maximizing how much of that nutrition we're actually able to pull out. So the distance, the length of your small intestine also helps the efficiency. By having it be 20 to 26 feet long, we can really maximize, again, how much material, how much time we have to draw that material out. Now, just on the other side of those villi, tiny little capillaries. So the villi suck out that nutrition, The capillaries run right on the other side of those villi, and that is where absorption actually takes place. We pull it out, and now we transition it into our bloodstream. Last one that we have talks about the large intestine. Large intestine is much shorter in length, 3 to 4 feet. So immediately people question, we've got 20 to 26 feet on the small intestine and 3 to 4 feet in the large intestine. The name difference does not come from the length. The name difference comes from the diameter of the tubes that we're dealing with. Small intestine has a smaller diameter. The large intestine has a larger diameter. The reason for the difference is because within the small intestine, we're trying to pull out materials. We're trying to absorb it into our bloodstream. With the large intestine, really, there's not a whole lot of absorption that happens at that point. By the time that chyme mixture gets into our large intestine, we're worried about pulling out as much excess water content as we can. So we don't want the large intestine to be really long because we would pull out so much water that moving that solid material out of our body would become very, very difficult. So it's a little bit wider in diameter and it's a little bit shorter, or a lot shorter, just so that we can pull out the right amount of water, but that we don't overdo it. So small intestine is focused on pulling out nutritional material and maximizing how much we get out. Large intestine is focused on pulling out water content and turning it from a chyme, a thick, soupy mixture, back into a solid material that we will eventually void and remove from the body. So that's our initial digestive discussion. We will come back and tie in a little bit more with the digestive enzymes and nutrition and exactly how that works within our bodies, but just a good foundation, a good overview on the different structures that we have within our digestive system and ultimately what their jobs are within our body.